Hello, my name is Sarah Garnish, and in this presentation, I'm going to discuss the ongoing environmental and health problems occurring in the aptly named area known as Chemical Valley. This presentation will demonstrate the enduring effects of colonialism with respect to inherent historical and legal issues present in this case. Recognizing this and similar cases may allow for the reconciliation process to effectively begin in both a regional and global context. Situated in Sarnia, Ontario, Chemical Valley is home to 63 petrochemical facilities encircling the Aamjiwnaang First Nation residents. The health impacts are glaring and have included miscarriages, asthma, high rates of cancer, polychlorinated biphenyl or PCBs, and mercury found in hair and blood samples, and the disproportionate births of females compared to males, known as an endocrine disruption, which has garnered considerable attention. The negative environmental conditions have caused Chemical Valley to be dubbed by the World Health Organization as a top Canadian hotspot for air pollution, and, as the picture on the slide suggests, it is a very menacing sight to see. The environmental minister's decision to permit Suncor to increase its petroleum refinement activities has potentially aggravated the already hazardous health and environmental situation and highlights the exploitative and imbalanced relationship between the state and Aboriginal peoples, a theme which has plagued Canada for years. This case, unfortunately, like many others involving Aboriginal peoples, is ongoing and unresolved. On February 8, 2014, a chemical spill by Plains Mainstream Canada, a chemical plant in the area, had benzene levels measured at 50 parts per billion. Prolonged exposure to high amounts of benzene can cause cancer. This should be cause for concern since 30 minutes of exposure to benzene would be 22 times the provincial standard. Even more recently, on February 23, 2017, flares due to Imperial Oil operations occurred, as depicted on the bottom picture of this slide. Imperial Oil alleged that the flares were due to equipment malfunction. The ministry noted that the flaring was of volatile organic compounds, namely the carcinogen benzene and sulfur. The World Health Organization has noted when speaking of benzene that, quote, no safe level of exposure can be recommended. These perceivable challenges for residents are alarming and demand action. Land is a crucial element of the cultural tradition of the Aamjiwnaang First Nations people. The name Aamjiwnaang itself translates to at the spawning stream. The reserve is currently located along the St. Clair River. However, water in Chemical Valley's Telford Lake has been contaminated. The word Aamjiwnaang in Ojibwe indicates an important gathering place. This gathering place was at the base of Lake Huron and has been used by First Nations for millennia. Its communal nature cannot be ignored. It is embedded in the very name and history of the Aamjiwnaang First Nations people. Notably, the Aamjiwnaang First Nation adhere to Anishinaabe law that maintains that individuals should be stewards of the land. This means there is a responsibility to care, respect, and oversee activities that occur on the land. Although the Aamjiwnaang First Nation has exclusive treaty rights to use and exercise harvesting rights on this traditional land, the petrochemical facilities' encroachment and imposition into their air quality is problematic. The land has also been used for conducting ceremonies and houses sacred sites, including burial sites which are not to be tampered with. The technicalities of their rights are not fully maintained in practice. Cultural and historical ties should further indicate the significance that the ancestral land represents and heighten the necessity to initiate positive change. You may be wondering how the current location of the Aamjiwnaang First Nation came to be. There was a gradual and continual reduction to the size of their traditional territory. In addition to the Treaty of Detroit, 1807, and Treaty 29, 1827, I want to specifically direct your attention to the mass reduction of land size by Sarnia's encroachment taking place in the years 1850 to 1950. The Aamjiwnaang First Nations territory was progressively and dramatically reduced from more than 10,000 to 3,100 acres. The 1892 Sarnia Indian Reserve map, present on this slide, demonstrates that the planning, resizing, and reshaping of traditional lands has a long history. However, the consequences of such minimization continue to reveal themselves through the economic exploitation of land. The Indian Act, a pivotal document outlining many aspects of Aboriginal peoples' life, entitled the Canadian government to fiduciary power to sell and surrender Aamjiwnaang First Nation territory. Fiduciary power can be thought of as the relationship between a trustee and its benefactor. However, due to the Aamjiwnaang First Nation's reduced population and territory size, this land became vacant and available for activities such as petrochemical manufacturing. This legacy of exploitation is arguably sustained by the environmentally harmful industrial practices, the lacking response to environmental and public health problems, and limiting the Aamjiwnaang First Nation's inherent right to territorial land. Further progress is required for a more equitable relationship. Sovereignty is a key concept to highlight. It is easily forgotten that Indigenous peoples have a preceding occupational history in the land now known as Canada. In 1995, the inherent right of Aboriginal peoples to self-government was recognized by the Canadian state. However, the right to protect traditional land has not been fully enjoyed by the Aamjiwnaang First Nation residents. Chemical Valley showcases the recurring effect of the Indian Act, where there is a transition from being allies to becoming what has been termed wards of the state. This means that there is a right to physically occupy the land, but there is little agency granted to the occupants. The Aamjiwnaang First Nation was historically allies to the French and later the British. Now it has become glaringly apparent through the petrochemical operations in Chemical Valley that there is an identifiable power inequality. The status as wards of the state, which has been maintained and perpetuated through the federal and provincial governments' control, has had devastating health and environmental effects by failing to conduct a health survey. This is alarming considering that Sarnia is 25 kilometers away from the plants. The close vicinity and the relegation to unsafe and minimal land demonstrates parallels to the history of colonization, which should not be ignored if steps are to be made to rectify this and similar issues involving Aboriginal peoples and the Canadian state. The legality of these issues have not gone unchallenged. In 2012, Ada Lockridge and Ron Plain, both members of the Aamjiwnaang First Nation, brought forth a legal claim against the Ministry of the Environment, precipitated by its decisions to allow Suncor to increase its petroleum refinement activities, as mentioned earlier. Unable to stand idly by, the litigants claimed that their right to procedural fairness was infringed. Furthermore, two specific sections of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms were cited as being infringed, namely Section 7, detailing life, liberty, and security of the person, and Section 15.1, affirming equality rights. These rights should be upheld in order to promote fairness and ensure the safety of residents. A cumulative assessment of the industry's impact was not administered. Therefore, the federal government has not taken full responsibility under Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982 to ensure that Aboriginal rights are recognized and affirmed and that the interests of Aamjiwnaang First Nation residents are adequately met. Additionally, the negative health and environmental effects of the petrochemical facility's operations are in contravention of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act 1999, which affirms that the federal government bears the responsibility to use regulatory and also non-regulatory measures to, quote, protect the environment and human health. Upholding this constitutional act has been considerably lacking. Comprehensiveness is a crucial approach needed to understand the overall impacts occurring in Chemical Valley. The environmental minister breached the court's mandate by failing to conduct a cumulative review of Chemical Valley. One may argue that further harm to the environment and health of residents may result due to this delay. This legal obligation under the Environmental Bill of Rights has a caveat of needing to be completed within a reasonable time. However, 8 years is not reasonable according to Lockridge. It has been argued as to whether there is a lack of government oversight in its response to emissions and industry leaks. This has been demonstrated through a lack of field response, failure to lay charges, and delayed reporting. One could argue, as Lockridge does, that the right to a healthy environment is a human right, one which has been greatly diminished by the industry's activities and the lack of governmental response. There's also been another legal action taken. Vanessa Gray, a member of the Aamjiwnaang First Nation, and Elaine McDonald, an eco-justice scientist, filed an application for the legal charges against Imperial Oil for violating two Ontario laws, namely emitting contaminants found to have a negative effect and discomfort and the inability to enjoy one's property. It is important to recognize that local residents are taking actions to ensure that their rights are upheld. This case, however, is not limited to local or even national contexts. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, an international document, may have been contravened, specifically Article 26.3 stating, quote, "States shall give legal recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources. Such recognition shall be conducted with due respect to the customs, traditions, and land tenure systems of the Indigenous peoples concerned." The arguably callous disregard for both the health and environmental conditions is not in accordance with the aforementioned article. The government should recognize these international standards in order to better protect Indigenous peoples. Furthermore, the United Nations Development Group Guidelines on Indigenous Peoples' Issues notes that through negotiation, a nation may address the issue of impediments to Aboriginal rights to development, which can be accomplished by ensuring that laws reflect and maintain both individual and collective rights. Greater attention and action is necessary for greater, potentially international, change. Colonization is not limited to the past, but reverberates and continues into the present, and without appropriate and sufficient change, it may seep into the future. One could relate the environmental minister's delay in conducting a cumulative review as mimicking the behavior of colonists, as predetermined agreements with Aboriginal peoples were not upheld and followed. The doctrine of discovery was a principle that maintained that, by virtue of, quote, discovering the land, a European power would acquire sovereignty by disregarding Aboriginal sovereignty and leaving them with the right of occupancy to reside but not to rule in the land. In Chemical Valley, residents have not been sufficiently granted agency over their own affairs, and any change or assertion to their rights has required concerted efforts by the residents. One could also draw similarities between failing to conduct a preliminary cumulative review to that of the 1969 White Paper, a document put in place by the Trudeau government effectively supporting an equitable end to the nation-to-nation relationship of treaties and the treaties itself between Aboriginal peoples and the Canadian state. In a similar vein, Chemical Valley is the result of a largely one-sided relationship with the Canadian state. Furthermore, the legality of the displacement of land that is both inferior and unhealthy for the purposes of exploitation, which in this case was for economic exploitation, is evident in this case. Considering the federal government regulates environmental law when it concerns Aboriginal land, this power can be used or misused. Historically, and in Chemical Valley, this control has not been sufficiently exercised, as evident by the health and environmental consequences. The residents of Chemical Valley have an attachment to the land, as mentioned previously, and this effectively leaves them between choosing their ancestral land and health, which limits their mobility, very similar to the past system which regulated movement on and off reserves. Like the picture on the slide illustrates, residents may feel trapped. Environmental racism has been raised in this case. Similar to colonists regarding Indigenous peoples as savages, in Chemical Valley, the treatment of the Aamjiwnaang First Nation may be uneven when compared to non-Aboriginal people. Finally, the Professional Engineers Government of Ontario has, since 2009, brought forth public health concerns and has been ignored by the Environmental Ministry to the effect of being called muzzling by PEGO. Such silencing continues the colonialist effect of minimizing the power and voices of Indigenous peoples. Although reconciliation is difficult, it is necessary in order to move away from the colonial legacy and ensure the health and environmental condition. To begin the process of reconciliation, the Canadian government needs to recognize the Aamjiwnaang First Nations Chinikawagan Community Constitution, outlining an adherence to the 7 grandfather teachings, and a dedication to a sustainable environment for future generations. Understanding the centrality of land and the duty to care for it according to Anishinaabe law will also aid in the reconciliation process, as measures can be taken by the state to ensure that land is protected and health is ensured. Adherence to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action may aid in the reconciliation process, specifically calls to action 43 and 44 outlining the adoption and implementation of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and 45I call to action, which calls upon the Government of Canada to repudiate the doctrine of discovery and the notion of terra nullius in order to ensure that Aboriginal sovereignty is recognized. The doctrine of discovery has been mentioned earlier. However, terra nullius in Latin means that land belongs to no one, and was used by Europeans to deny Aboriginal sovereignty, since land was not considered to be owned by anyone worthy. Overcoming the colonial mentality is necessary for reconciliation and progress towards a more equitable relationship. Although greater attention has been given to Chemical Valley, action now must be made to combat the negative effects. Thank you for listening to this presentation.